Hi, my name is George Ransom, and I'm part of the Walpole Historic Commission and also Walpole Historic Society. We're here today to present to you a PowerPoint presentation we did on Barns of Walpole. As part of the commission, we were establishing a identification of actually how many barns are there in Walpole, what types are they, what conditions are they in, and as part of a survey, we were able to identify some of the local barns. I have some pictures for you on the local barns and also a little bit of a background on types of barns, when they were built, where they were, and what to look for in establishing historical guidelines for barns. Next slide, please. This is probably one of the oldest barns in Walpole. It's the Glen Green Farm, built originally in 1789. It's a tremendous barn complex. It's part of the New England Connected Barn. You'll see more of this later as the show evolves. Next slide. Introduction. So to start us off, this is the barns are part of what is in America as American countryside. Barns are basically shrines to a good life and ought to be remembered. They're part of our vanishing history. So we're going to take a look at the types of barns, also some outbuildings. I'll have a chance to talk a little bit about some of the materials and the design. We'll see the local Walpole barns that I was able to capture from the street side during the last fall. And just as a curiosity, anybody have an idea of how many barns there are in Walpole? I happen to be quite surprised to find out there were as many as there were. Next slide, please. To start us off, this is a typical bank barn, and bank barns were built on the side of a hill, allowing access from both the front and rear, and an underneath corral. Next, this is a typical Dutch barn, an old established barn with the door at the gable end for access. Next. This is a crib barn, and more frequently seen in the South, but they're able to hold several pens and store crops for feeding of the animals. Smaller type barn. Next slide. Round barn. Many of us have seen round barns, and this is a picture of a typical round barn. Next slide. A lot of the barns, as they were evolved, changed their style, and this particular picture depicts the overhang necessary to keep a lot of the rainwater out from the entrance of the doorway, as you can see. Next. Here we're going back to a round barn, which actually isn't a round barn. It's actually a 16-sided barn. The round barns were famous in certain areas because they used considerably less wood when there was a big shortage of lumber around. Next slide. As barns got to be more ornate, this is a picture of a Victorian barn. There is one here in Walpole on display. We'll have a chance to see a little bit of it later. It's basically pretty far in on the property, locally downtown, so we can't get a good view of it, but there is that representation here as part of the Walpole barns. Next slide, please. As barns evolved, part of the barns that helped out were ventilation, and we see here a pretty elaborate cupola, and at the far end we can see a lightning rod. Fires in barns and around farming was quite prevalent, along with lightning strikes. So the lightning rod was there to attract lightning and dissipate it to the ground. And as far as the vents, there was tremendous heat buildup with the hay and the animals, and they needed to be venting more than just from the sides. So the vents were basically placed on the top to allow the airflow. Next slide. This is an example of a long barn out in the Midwest. It's 1.5 stories, mainly for cattle, and it's probably 150 feet long. Metal roof, the windows along the side for air and ventilation. Next slide. Red barn. So as we saw from my picture earlier, many of the barns were painted red. We'll talk a little bit about the criteria for red later and how it evolved. This has a little bit more ornamentation than many of the other barns. Next. So why red? I was always curious, what's with all the red barns? Well, red was one of the most prevalent colors 200 years ago and happened to be the most least expensive paint and was readily available. So in addition, what's in the red mix, I was very surprised. There's a red pigment, a cadmium and or ferric oxide, along with skin milk and a little linseed oil to help with the penetration on the wood. But many of the barns, more so out of New England, were painted red. And of course, DuPont is famous for paint. Identified a couple of colors and called it box red or caboose red. And their theory was that farmers suffered from a saturation of green in their environment, and the red provided them with a little bit of balance. In addition to significant colors, after some issues, dairy farmers traditionally always painted their barns white. Next slide. This is a picture of a barn with no supporting structure inside before it was rehabbed. We'll see a little bit later there was no structure in the middle of the barn. Thank you. Next. So here we are. We're all painted, decorated. The vents are in. Plenty of windows for light along the side, and plenty of space for farming practices. Thank you. Next. Opening the doors in winter. Well, as you can guess, in the winter with a lot of snow, the doors are massive and heavy. Doors have to be big enough to allow wagons and barns to allow entry with hay load and other supplies in there from the local farmer. So the doors were quite heavy, difficult to open. The hinges never seemed to work and always seemed to have trouble. And especially if you get a couple of feet of snow, it becomes difficult to open the door and provide readily access. Soon to be remedied later. Next. Also connected to the barn was oftentimes a corral. Some of the barns stored animals. In the picture you'll see here, a couple of horses right outside the barn could easily enter the protected area. Next. So, weather vanes. So in addition to the functionality of the cupola up there, adornment was a popular item. And here we see an elaborate weather vane up on the barn. Next. Round barns. Just this is a picture I took from a local book on round barns, and there was, as I said, no framing in the middle to obstruct the area of the barn, and it could use considerably anywhere from 30 to 50% less lumber in its construction, and so that's what it looked like from the inside with the venting out there. Next. Metal roofs were often used in barns, and this is a typical picture out west where the cattle was, and a single roof metal barn were pretty prevalent. Next slide. This is one of the traditional New England bank barns, and it's called a bank barn because there's a embankment leading you to the entry on the side, and there's a carved underneath cellar, not quite a full cellar, but there's space underneath for later on manure drops. As you can see, there's the cupolas up top for the venting and window adornments along the sides. Next slides. So a little more of the details of this New England bank barn. This was a wooden ramp leading up to the door. Windows along the side to add some light, and the details were impressive because there was a lot of heat buildup, and there wasn't much light in there before electricity. Next slide. Tack rooms. There are a number of tack rooms here in Walpole, and this is a picture of what a typical tack room might have looked like 100 years ago. Saddles, bridles, and all the various equipment necessary for both horses and carriages. And carriages were quite prevalent here in Walpole. We'll see a couple of barns later on. We get into the specifics of the Walpole barns with the tack rooms. Next slide. Anybody visited the Pennsylvania Dutch country? This is a standard Dutch barn. You can see the gambrel roof with the angled sides, and particularly because of the cement sidewalls, rock and cement was pretty prevalent in the area, and certainly these are substantial structures still standing today. Door along the side and several windows built in. Next slide. We're all typically from New England, so we are familiar with the sugar house or the maple sugar house. And these are kind of unique structures to New England. There's a lot of openness to the roof because there's pots boiling for extended periods of time in there. Next slide. Back to some of the details of the hinges, as you can see in this picture. The massive size of the doors, and as you can tell, we were talking earlier that the doors never seemed to close with those hinges because they were so big and difficult to kind of manage. The overhangs are still there, and some of the barns had open sections for farming work to be done and storage. Next. Water towers. Didn't find any in Walpole at the time of doing this presentation, but barns typically, or farms typically have water tanks and water towers. This is a picture of a water tower for storage next to a barn. Next. So some more details on some of the venting. And as you can see, there's a standard cupola. We've got the dormant on top. We also have several windows. And now we're moving from the door on the gable end to the side. And this actually is probably dated back to about after 1850, because we see the sliders on there. And this was a big advantage for the bank barns and other barns, because you could just slide the door open, drive the carriage in, and proceed to do your farming work. Next. Details of this slider. So the slider is built on a similar roller to what you might find as a result of what we saw done with the railroads. There's a rail up there, and the door fits right on and just can fairly easily slide right over and is not encumbered by the snow. Next slide, please. Outbuildings. As you travel through, and I've traveled through, the number of outbuildings here along the area, but some of the typical outbuildings you may see a ham house, a machine shop, water tower, silos, chicken coops, nut house, smokers, sometimes outhouses, root cellars. There may be a privy out there, a woodshed, and even an outdoor oven. Silos were added around 1900, and they were basically built of vertical boards held together by wires and hoops, and some were made of stone during the wood shortage period. But we'll have a chance to see some of those later. Next. Typical red barn. This is a fairly large barn. The gambrel roof, access, as you can see, on the side with the rail entry point. Next. Before rehab, this is what an 80-year-old barn might have looked like after years of neglect. Next slide. And as they start to repair it and fix it up, they're in the process of extensive rehabilitation. Same figures and dimensions are used. Boards are shored up, and the classic red paint is applied. Next. Out west, you may see what was more typical of a long barn with the metal roof. There's an open section in between, and these are rough hewn logs joined together as part of the barn. Next. So some building materials. Well, we've seen wood, we've seen fieldstone for some of the foundations. Some of them were built with cinder blocks. You go out to the west and there may be some adobe or glacial rocks used. The number of tools were basically hand tools. So we've seen axes, augers, chisels, mauls, open hand saws, and wooden hammers to pound the beams together. And in the early part of the 1700s, barns were all made by hand and primarily by a farmer and or more of a skilled carpenter in the local area. Next, we see barns that had extensions on them. And as the barn originally was built a standard height, they were readily and easily able to, as farming procedures grew, build extensions. So this barn, as we would see, has two significant extensions on both sides. Next. A western barn, unpainted, not red, old doors, so this is probably dating us before 1800. And then off to the right you can see there's a lean-to where equipment is stored, at least out of the inclement weather. Next. So to give you an example of some of the types of roof, this is a standard gambrel setup, and you can see some of them as they've changed over the years a little bit in the style, and that helps us if we're looking to date the barn. One of the other significant facts, we can see that they're all handmade, and they used handmade nails. So if you can look in some of the barns, you can see that it's all mortised and tenon together. Significant sized beams on hand-cut nails were used to nail things together on some levels. Next. So here we are looking at another addition. This is more of a Pennsylvania type barn with the additions built on the side. It's a salt box, and the longer side is typically toward the northeast to protect from the weather. Next. In New England, we've had some harsh winters, and typically harsh winters really hampered farming practices. So New England developed a series of connected farm buildings and houses. We'll have a chance to see some of those later, but this is a schematic done in a book on barns that shows you that there's a connectedness, so the farmer never had to, at some point, go outside during tremendous inclement weather periods, still could tend to his horses, sheep, farm animals, cows, and other farming procedures could be done without going out in the weather. Next slide. So here's a plan where you see the house, you see a barn, you see the shed. There's a single shed, another shed, significant sized barn, and then another shed attached. So as you can tell, it's became quite prevalent in years gone by. Next. Round barns. So these are typically associated, and this is a picture of a Shaker barn, and many of us have gone out to see the Shaker villages, and this is all made of stone, and they were very prevalent with use of a round barn. Next slide. So round barns. Well, interesting to note that the Shakers primarily used round barns, and they identified that there are basically no corners for the devil to hide in. Besides, they were using anywhere from 30 to 50% less lumber. We have many in the local area, and a lot of them were made of stone, so they're still well preserved. Next. This is a schematic I copied out of a book to give you an example that still on the same idea, principle of a bank barn. A single farmer could take his hay in, enter on one side, rotate around the barn, drop his hay off. His animals were stored typically on the lower level. He could store the hay or feed the animals directly and perform very many barn procedures. Drive the animals right around in the wagon, right out by himself, and that was quite efficient. Next slide. Silos, more so in other areas are typical. Silos were always associated with barns for the additional storage of corn, grain, and other products for the animals to eat. Originally they were made of hoops and wires, as we said earlier, with a top. And as you can see in the picture, it does look like it's windblown, and which is probably the case, and it kind of reverts back to its original shape after the storm would subside, but they were an intricate part of farming. Next. Here's probably a better picture, an example of the sugar shack or the sugar barn. As you can see, significant openings into the side of the hill, protecting from the snow, and allowing the wood to be able to burn there for lengthy periods of time. Next. Some other sugar houses, you actually see that there's maybe in some cases an outdoor procedure where they start the boiling process. Several places where you can store the wood because they use a lot of wood during the boiling of significant sized pots, and some cover for the farmer as he begins to process the sugar into maple syrup. Next slide. The American corn crib, and this was primarily a storage barn for corn, significant crop in other areas for eating, but here oftentimes it was used for feeding the cattle. Next. Following up on the corn crib, this was a single corn crib that allowed the farmer could drive his rig or his wagon right underneath, unload corn on both sides, and provide access for storage for later for feeding of animal stock. Next. Some different types of cupolas. As you can see, based on the areas, barns got more elaborate, people became, and farming became more profitable, and some of the elaborate adornments of the cupolas are seen here in these pictures. Actually, there's one of them is a ice house, and there was an ice house locally in Walpole, and there's still a number of barns with significant cupolas that we'll have a chance to see. Next. The doors. Well, the doors are a significant structure to keep the other animals out and the farm animals in, along with protection from the weather. And as you can see how massive some of the doors are, they become difficult to slide open. These are the early hinges that were done in some of the elaborate doors that we had a chance to see. On the left-hand side, you can see a little bit of the pre-roller door that begins to evolve basically after or just before 1850, when the railroads were prevalent. Next. This is a depiction of some of the local tools. So all someone needed to do to cut the lumber, once it was cut, there's an awl, a maul, a beetle, a hammer, a level, a couple of chisels, and a small saw. And that was basically all that was needed for a farmer and or a carpenter to begin carving wood for a barn. Interesting to note that there were very few architectural plans for barns. It was more up to a local builder and their skills along with the farmer to put together a particular style of barn. Next. Some other outhouses that have different dimensions. You see some storage areas, wood storage, portable piggery, place for wagons and or other farm equipment, and necessary because there's a lot of equipment related to the farming process. Next. Advertisements, more so out west than here, but the barns were large, iconic pieces for us to see, and here we see a large space for advertising. Next. And here we are, advertising feed on this barn, but they were very visible from the roads. Next. So most of the sketches that I've presented to you so far were done by Eric Sloan, who's a local Connecticut guy who's a famous painter, and come to find out that he produced this wonderful book on with all the sketches that we've seen here on Barns in the area. Next. So Barns of Walpole. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty of where the barns are and what was happening. This is an initial roadside survey. As I've said before, I had no idea how many barns there were still in Walpole. And this is an undertaking by the Walpole Historic Commission to identify, establish, and help preserve the local barns. So we're here to start that off, to take a look at some of the conditions of barns, and all of the photos that I've seen, you'll see here going forward, were done from the street with the iPad. Next. So go out to North Street, Crescent Farm, Hillcrest Farm, and this is a typical New England type barn you see in the front, anywhere from 30 to 40 to 60 feet long, cupola, and significant doors along the side that were basically on hinges, so we know that that was probably prior to 1850. Next. So to start us off, I live on in Walpole on Plimpton Street, so I've had a chance to go down to see the Calvin Plimpton house and the barn. Not a great picture of the barn, but this is a 2.5-story barn. It was built around 1860. Attached to it's a 5-car garage. It's heated. There's chauffeurs' quarters upstairs. It follows the criteria of a bank barn with land sloping off in the back. There's a tack room in here. There's a standard wooden doors that you can see. It's 2.5 stories, and a tremendous cupola is there. Next. Across the street, 41 Plimpton Street. Can't see it from the road, but this was a carriage barn of the Lewis Farm. And it was always a residence on top, and they stored the carriages below on the farm. And this was two local architects bought the house about 30 years ago, in the process of rehabbing it. The whole bottom is a family room, kitchen, eating area, bedrooms upstairs. Really a beautiful concept, 13, 14-foot ceilings. I saw it originally when there were carriages stored there. This is on 42 Plimpton Street. Next. Along the Lewis Plimpton area, this is 439 East Street, and this was the Polly Plimpton house, 1.5-story barn, somewhere around similar probably 1870s. Tack room in here. This was primarily not with farming, but there's a beautiful tack room there, and horse and carriage was stored there primarily. Next. Right next door to my house, this is fairly new. Doesn't meet the criteria of a barn. It looks like a barn. Originally was built to primarily house some of a prior owner's landscape and construction equipment, but the new neighbors moved in, and she has a couple of miniature horses out along the back and side. You can see the corral off to the left, and the door up top for additional storage. So she has a couple of small ponies there. So next. Walking and driving by, this is on Pilgrim Street. I thought it was a barn, couldn't understand why there were that many. There's about 6 bays underneath it, and we did the presentation at the library about a month ago, and somebody identified that the owner had built that to store his antique cars there. So there's about 6 bays underneath. You can barely see the bays, but they're there. Next. Typical New England style farm. We're on Fisher Street, heading up toward Bubbling Brook. This is more elaborate farm. You can see the ornamentation is there. shutters on the windows, all beautiful green, clapboards on the side, traditional doors, double doors, windows over top, 1.5 stories, and it slopes off to the side and back. So next, moving up the street, this is once again an example of the New England connected barns, and this is Hillcrest Farms, farmhouse, extension on the house, connecting to the barn, probably around the same era. Large barn doors, a couple of windows, and then there's probably 4 or 5 stalls that now are garages, and I'm assuming that there was storage for farm equipment along the way. Next, moving up toward North Street, where Fisher goes into North. New England barn. This was encased with cedar shingles, more so in New England than in other places with an abundance of cedar shingles we see here on the barn. And this probably dates 1860, 1870, connected to the farm. Next. Still on North Street, significant large barn, probably 40 feet by 60, 1.5 stories. And now this was done somewhere after the 1950s and 60s, where you see the large sliding doors that will open up on, still on a bank a little bit, for the farm animals. The farmer could drive his hay wagon in one door and out the other side. Next. Hard to see from this view, but this was right across the street, and 1125 North Street. And this was a stable, actually 2 stables there. They were fairly recently built, fit in with the neighbors, 1 and 1.5 story, with a couple of outbuildings here. There's several horses out there if you can stop and see. Next. Going up and turning the corner, we head on to Old North Street. This is one of the older barns, and I'm kind of far away taking the picture, but you can see that this is a significantly long barn, probably at least 60 feet long. Cupola, 2 major massive doors on the sides, not the gable end. Farm equipment, there's an additional building here, part of a elaborate estate, a farm estate years ago. Next. Traveling up North Street, still on the old North Street side, tucked in back of this fairly large house is a barn, typically a New England type barn. Over to the right is a salt box garage setup, but you can see the barn is still there in great shape. Still on North Street. Next. Turning the corner, heading across the street on North Street. This is a new name on the farm here, but still an old farm. Tremendous buildings here. This basically was a barn, farm, stable complex, and I was told years ago that the owner had a horse stall in here and a track underneath the new barn. It's really very, very large, and they used to have fox hunts out there, as we've been told. There are a number of buildings on the process we'll see in the next slide. Next. So here's a slide view of the barn with a couple of additions on the side. Next. There's a better view of the additions. I'm not sure what was here, but there's a further addition on the far side that you can see as we head towards sunset. Next. Not a great picture, but this is a new horse stable in here, and it's probably the largest stable in Walpole. It's well over 5,000 square feet, and they do quite a bit of riding there. Next. Rounding the corner, heading over toward North Street again. This is the Nightingale Farm, and as you can tell by the typical sign, yellow painted cedar shingles, slider for one of the doors, or two of the doors that open up, and dates it somewhere past 1850 or 60. Next. Sunny Rock Farm. So, as most of us have, who grew up and seen Walpole change, Sunny Rock Farm was one of the largest farming complexes in Walpole. And I hadn't been down North Street for a number of years. Sad to see that this was the only outbuilding left, and there were, as I remember, 3 or 4 major dairy farm buildings, storage units, and other complexes. They housed the 4-H club. They sold products. You can get your pumpkins and other homemade items made there on the farm, along with milk. And that happened to be torn down fairly recently. Sad to see it. Somebody set me up a link to a YouTube video where somebody actually recorded the destruction of the Sunny Rock Farm video. So it was kind of difficult to watch after being in Walpole for years and seeing that this is no longer part of the farming process in the area. Next. Moving down the street here, we're at 425 North Street, still on the same street. This is a typical New England barn, but we're going to focus here on the underneath. As you can see, it's open underneath, and that's for the manure to fall off. Years ago, tuberculosis and or other diseases were prevalent. Milk stored and farming animals basically were near the manure, so the manure was dropped through a trap, and the farmer could hitch his wagon up to the side and back and remove the manure. Next. There's a side or front view. You can see it's a standard New England barn with the door in front. Dates it somewhere prior to 1850. Stone wall in front, off to the side. Next. Barely visible driving by High Street. I encountered this barn. I could barely even see it, but there's still remnants of a barn there. I'm not sure if it's used in any farming capacity at this point. Next. We've been talking about barns and the larger dairy complexes, but here we have a significant former chicken coop. Next. Barns converted to houses. I was surprised to find that a number of the local barns no longer used in the farming practices were converted to houses, and some of the barns have been moved. So I'll identify some of those on an upcoming basis, but I was surprised to find that there were about 6 or 7 barns that were converted to houses and or living quarters. Next picture, please. So on High Street, here we are, typical New England setup, beautiful red color. You can see the original outline of the barn door here on the front with a white trim. Beautiful new roof on here. And I had a chance to see when it was, this barn was up for sale to go inside and tour it. Still had some of the exposed timbers, and quite an elaborate house. So somebody would be pleased to be able to live in this kind of a structure. It's different. Next. Side view, lots of opportunity for windows to open up light to enter the barn. Significant chimney on the barn, which you usually don't see. So now we know it's living quarters. Next. Some of our outbuildings, I'm not sure what they were used for, but I'm sure probably a mechanic shop, carpentry, and or other farming processes were conducted here in some of the outbuildings. Next. Not a great picture. Off in the distance you can see the red barn, but this was a house conversion that was picked up by one of the local TV shows. house hunters, and the folks chose this particular house to rehab. And in the back there's a beautiful red barn. Next. Those of us who've been in Walpole for a number of years, my daughter actually had a chance to go with Mrs. Davies and attend the Walpole Country Day School. When she lived in this house, she actually used part of the house, a porch that she had converted, along with the original barn there for a nursery school for a number of years. So that was evident to a lot of folks. Next. Right across the street, once again, a New England connected barn. This barn is just being rehabbed, but part of the section of the house. Next. Still on Common Street, this is probably the most elaborate barn that I had a chance to run into, converted to storage and housing option right here on Common Street. Next. Not sure if it's a barn, but I included it anyways. To set the criteria, we're typically looking for buildings that were primarily used as primary farming and/or farming practices. So there's a winch on there, two bays. It looks like there's a construction company owner that lives there, but this is on Lincoln Road. Next. A little further down on Lincoln Road is this. You can see how small the house is. An old barn, converted second floor, skylights indicating probably residential housing options on the second floor, but a two-car garage. Next. Now we're looking at, I guess, one of the oldest barns in Walpole, the Glen Green Farm, recently just sold. Identified that it was built in 1789 by the sign on it. However, when I did the original presentation, a couple of the old Walpole individuals identified that it burnt down around 1960, and the owner had it replaced and rebuilt to what it used to look like. So if there was a barn of that vintage that was here, that would have been the oldest barn in Walpole. It does certainly look authentic. Next. Still the same barn complex. The side view, there's an open stall here. There's a storage area, probably some other farming practices, and there's the well right there, all connected to the farm, probably about 60 feet long from the barn to the house. Next. Out back from the original barn is a secondary barn, probably not as old as the first, but used to store this horses that are out there, as you can see. I don't know if you can probably see them today, but they're out there, and there's an additional building behind that barn there, recently just sold. So, next. This is probably a good description of an older New England type barn on Lincoln Road. Not had a lot of recent upkeep. Doors on the gable end, they're not sliders, so we know that they're somewhere probably prior to 1850. Very little window and no other access. But a good example of what the barn would have looked like when it was originally built. Cedar shingles are still on it, and kind of replicates the same roof and the cedar shingles on the house. Next. Right across the street on Lincoln Road, is a beautifully built new stable, horse stable, with a corral right next to it. A lot of open land. All corralled land there beside the barn. Next. Still on Lincoln Road, up the street, there's a metal roof. It's a smaller salt box barn slash storage building. It's about 1 story high. Their doors look like they're not on sliders but on hinged. Probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 1870, 1860. Next. Moving back to East Walpole, this was a barn on 33 Beach Street, right down the street from where I live. I go by it all the time. There's built on a fieldstone foundation. The guy who lives there, Rob, basically is a contractor, so he has some storage of equipment and facilities there in a 1.5 story barn. Next. Still on East Street, barely visible now that the trees are losing their leaves. When I took the pictures last fall, small barn, one of the probably smallest in Walpole. It might have been just for the storage of a horse or a horse and a carriage on East Street. Next. Grasshopper Lane, right across from the junior high school, and this was a traditional barn, fairly new doors, and you can see the cupola. So, and the building on your right was moved there at some point and attached. There's a chimney there, and this functions as living quarters. Next. So barns converted to houses. How many do we have? Well, we basically have about 6 or 7. When I did the presentation originally, a lady came up to me and said, well, my house wasn't included, and she lives on Ponderosa Lane, and I wasn't able to get a picture at the time, but I absolutely would have never identified it. So we have 42 Plimpton, several on Peach Street, South Street, a couple on High Street, East Street. On Common Street, it's a pool house, rec room, and the Walpole Country Day School is a converted living space. Next. So 24 Peach Street, this was my friend Tony's house. Went in it, and he was telling me it was a barn. And I just didn't believe him. I mean, it's a very substantial classic New England house, vintage, probably 1850s. And the only way he would tell us, we took me up to the attic and looked at some of the rafters and how it was built, and it was part of the Allen Farm, 24 Peach Street. Next. Moving down the road on Peach Street, this is another attached barn, converted to living quarters, a salt box garage off to the side. Next. Right next door, as I've been told, this house is scheduled to be presented before the Historic Commission because they're going to be petitioning to tear it down and put a new house up, a housing complex up, a couple of houses there. So we'll see that in the future. But there's a connected 1.5 story barn to an extension on the house. Next. Many of us are familiar with Jones's barn on the corner of Great Plains Avenue, barn slash stable slash construction equipment, fairly significant barn. Looks to be in good shape. And he still has a couple of horses out there. Next. Just behind where Jones is this barn complex on 763 Washington Street. Open, there's no door on it, and I guess it's in question about what the future holds for this barn. Next. This is the used to be LaRusso house, and now it's John Domenico's. But that's the elaborate barn there, barely visible, but it's there on Victorian connection there on Common Street. You can see it better from the back side. Next. Moving over to South Street, This was a 1.5-story barn converted to a house. Next. Barns and living spaces, difficult to convert, great use of space. Some of the barns that we'll see later were housed antiques. Next. As I was speaking earlier, this was a former antique 1700 Washington Street, very visible yellow barn, 2.5 stories. It's fairly significant in size, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 feet wide by 60 feet long. Next. Right directly across the street, another Victorian type barn, 1.5 stories, and not sure on the address here because I'm relying on mailboxes, and oftentimes you couldn't depict the numbers, but right across the street, visible from the street. Victorian type barn complex connected to the house. Next. Right around the corner from the South Street, we're on the Ponce Street next, right across from the Mann House. And this is a barn converted to garage, to a storage area, 2-story, 2.5-story, 3-bay barn, farm complex. Next. Right behind the house, which was just recently, I guess, changed ownerships, repainted, looks beautiful. Got away from the traditional white and moving on to a gray color, but that's an outhouse building right there. It looks to be in great shape. Next. Over on Lewis Avenue, fairly good sized barn, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 1840, 1850 when it was built. Next. Over to East Street again, once again connected to the house, 1.5-story barn with a beautiful loft up there. I actually had a chance to be in this several times. It was recently just sold. Nice complex. You can drive around the back and get in also. Next. Right around the corner from my house, when I first moved here to Walpole, take an apple up, and there were a couple of horses that were always being boarded here. It's a gambrel style, fairly new barn garage, typical garage door type setup, but there was horses that were there, so it was kind of fun to go up and do that. Next. On East Street, wasn't able to get the mailbox and number. This house I think recently sold. I see some moving trucks and some other rehab being done, but a separate detached barn. I have another picture later. We'll see from the other side. It's probably more clear what it looks like. Next. Root cellars. Many of the farming processes had connected root cellars, and they fall into 2 categories. One is the wet cellar, where they would keep the milk, butter, cheese, and then the dry cellar where they'd have turnips, carrots, potatoes, carrots, and other type garden or truck crops. And then in some places there's a spring house or a water house for storage of ice. A couple of them were on the Lewis farm. Next. Here's the East Street house. You can see the size of the barn. It's fairly good size. Next. Right in the corner of High Plains and East Street is the former Allen House, and there's the connected 1.5-story barn, now used as a garage. Next. Traveling over to Union Street, it's well preserved. Barn has a beautiful example of a barn when you rehab it, what it might look like. This is probably 1880, 1890 barn used as a garage. Next. over on East Street heading toward downtown. Fairly significant size barn with an addition on the side. I'm assuming it was part of the farm at some point. Next. Out over to Winter Street. This is fairly new. This was a stable, and there were basically two fairly significant sized barns on this property. Next. Moving back toward East Walpole, 25 Park Lane. This is fairly new, and as I understand, there's a storage of a fire truck in there, along with some other work for a contractor who lives there. Next. Right on the corner on Everett Street from my house on Plimpton. This was the Everett house has been in the family for years. And this was a building that was used for farm equipment storage. And as you can see in the picture, there's a remaining gas pump there. Next. Up on East Street, not a great shot visible from the road, but an old house and a fairly significantly sized connected barn set up behind there on East Street. Next. This is a better picture of the Polly Plimpton house on East Street, always used as the horse stable. Next. Right next to the Lewis farm was a house, or barn converted to a house, not visible from the street, but this was a beautiful structure that was rehabbed and fixed up into a house. Next. Walpole Woodworkers. This was an original barn, a couple of attachments built onto it. Didn't include any of the barns in the Woodworkers complex as actual barns, other than this one. Next. Go by Walpole Woodworkers, and here's some examples of some how ornate you can get with your cupolas or your ventilation caps for your barn and or house. Next. Over to Kendall Street. As I've been told, this barn was actually moved there, but the owner has kept it up, and it's in beautiful shape. You can see the elaborate windows and all the ornamentation on it, so probably dates prior to 1850 or before 1850. Next. The Lewis Farm. I didn't include any pictures of the Lewis Farm. I have some in the Historic Society where we see what the barns used to look like, but one of the most significant farms in the area. There were 4 major barns on the complex, and you can still see, and I've seen the foundations of where they were. And in back, there's a building called the Piggery. It's about 100 feet long, barely a story high, but it housed a fairly significant herd of pigs that were there. Right next to that complex, it was a machine shop and a farm manager's house. And the folks who bought the house kind of joined the two of them together and put a connection in between, and they have a traditional smaller cape connected to the machine shop. Was converted to living space, and really made quite a lovely house out of the setting there. Next. What condition the barns are in. This is right here on East Street, right out of downtown. Looks like somebody started some work on the house, and the barn is still in a neglected shape. Next. We've seen this earlier, but this was the barn on East Street. Next. As we've talked about a little earlier, once again the New England barn was probably one of the most prevalent barns we've seen here in Walpole. And this one is looks like fair condition. Thank you. Next. The small family farms. Many of the folks were involved in the farming process. This, as I've told at the time of the production of this video, they're in the process of tearing it down. So this was right next to the road on Winter Street, and there's a series of 3 or 4 small buildings where they had strawberries, fruits, some pigs, some goats, a couple of prized animals lived there on some of the small outbuildings. What's interesting to note about this particular farm is it has the foundation of a silo, so I wasn't able to find any existing silos in Walpole at this time. So we'll see in a later picture the foundation of a silo. Next. So here we have the silo that was there. Next. Traveling over to South Street, 1.5-story barn tucked behind this house. Primarily storage for a single animal and or a family farm. Next. A little further down on South Street, this is an older barn prior to 1850. Next. Question whether this was a barn. I saw it from the road. It's one of the light bodies identified that had nothing to do with farming process, but built the barn a number of years ago and uses it for the business and or storage on South Street. But he did paint it traditionally red, so it does follow the criteria of a barn. Next. Over on East Street, tucked away, this was a huge barn. It's 2.5 stories high barn on East Street, right next to, right down the street from Jimmy's Pizza. And it's got the traditional sliding barn door there and cedar shingles on the outside. Got the little overhang on there, and off to the left you can see that it's open. Next. Some other information, at some point between 1800 and 1900, there were 5 million Americans living on farm lots. So other questions we have, why were so many fires there? Well, the heat from the thatch attracted a lot of electricity, so a lot of the barns and other structures were likely to attract a lightning strike. And then we have lightning rods and vents put in was an alternative. Many of a certain generation were subjected to watching some of the famous Western TV shows. We see a barn building in 1985 movie Witness. Many of us who were around saw Boomtown and Bonanza and many of the other TV shows that were famous for the family farm and farming. Little House on the Prairie, My Friend Flicker, Lonesome Dove, Green Acres were all noted, watched TV shows of an era, probably gone by at this point. Next. Identified here as a barn owl, eating little critters who would enter the barn, so kept a lot of the pest control done by the barn owl. Next. Not pictured. I wasn't able to include pictures of some of the barns, but there's a beautiful bank barn there on Elm Street, but first one we talk about is on Union Street. I think it's an antique shop. I can't be for sure, but it's just as you go by Dunkin' Donuts. The Elm Street complex was rehabbed a short time ago, as I've told. A barn on West Street, 124 Main Street, right up near the Pilgrim restaurant. Turner Road, barely visible from the street, but it's pretty far in, but it's there. There's a horse farm on Granite Street. a little one-story barn or building on Union Street, and 2 on Common Street that I'm not sure were actually related to farming process, but they were basically barns. And there's a Winter Street barn that is in the process, barn complex that's in the process of being scheduled for demolition. So at this point we have 3 barns that are scheduled to be torn down. So hopefully that the advocate for the Historical Society can help and Commission can help identify and preserve some of these wonderful aspects of life in rural times of barns and farming. Next. Resources. I was able to find a barn journal, New England Barns, tracing some of the history and ancestry back. Eric Sloan's depiction of all the pictures of barns. Next slide. Wikipedia, you can look up online and find some of those. There's a National Historic Trust, Walpole Historic Commission and Society stores and has a number of pictures of old barns. So if you own an old barn or have curiosity about it, they're open on every Saturday from 2 to 4 in the afternoon. And also a resource was the American by Design. It's more of an architectural digest of some of the barns. Next. Acknowledgement. Some of the help was done by Justin Chilton, my son-in-law, helping with the computer. Roger Turner from the Historic Commission and Society for technical assistance. Several other members of the Historic Commission and Society contributed to the production of the barn project. We're just getting started on the formal parts of it now. And later on we'll be going to the town assessor's office. I do have a current list of the barns in Walpole. So at the time I did this, I was able to find 76 barns. On the assessor's list, he has 128 barns listed. And before we go now, I give you that picture of the dairy barn there. Fairly significant size dairy barn, but painted white. And that was due to tuberculosis issues we've seen in history. So they all had additional freezer cold storage built into the barns, and immediately get them out to be processed so the milk doesn't sit long. Next. The end. As an outtake, we have one more picture to show you. Oh, pardon me, we forgot about the windmills. I was able to find a historical record of some windmills. So Frank Larrabee, who's a noted historian here in Walpole for years, documented that in 1985, took a look back and was able to find that there were 20 working windmills in the town of Walpole. And strange to find out that they were, the reason you could find that because they were on the tax rolls. So they were taxed at this time. So 20 farms had windmills, and a couple of mills were identified also to produce water and later electricity. Thanks for viewing the Barns of Walpole Show.